to the end game of this festival, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Nicholas Kennedy, who's been associated with this institution for some years, even though he's very useful. He's recently become a Dr. Nicholas Kennedy with the work on Beethoven's some of the late Beethoven piano sonatas. And what I like about Nicholas Kennedy particularly is not just a pianist or fantastic pianist and fantastic musician, he also is a thinker. In fact, I think he's a philosopher, he just doesn't know it. And that's what I like particularly about it, because I have some interest in philosophy. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Kennedy for a wonderful, wonderful program.
The relentless figuration of the first movement, in which Beethoven expressed life's hard struggle, should be chiselled out with steely fingers, while the arietta, which represents the transcendental, should be played with a touch so dematerialised as not to seem to be of this world. So wrote the great Swiss pianist-conductor Edwin Fischer about Ludwig van Beethoven's final piano sonata, the Sonata Opus 111. Opus 111, along with its earlier companions in the trilogy of Beethoven's last three piano sonatas, the sonatas Opera 109 and 110, has been discussed pretty much since the time of its composition in terms of poetic narratives of life, death, and the afterlife. And this is intuitive insofar as these works were written towards the end of Beethoven's life and career. They're also works that run the full gamut of human emotions, each seemingly encompassing a lifetime of experience. And their epic journeys, which in the case of the first and third, Opus 109 and 111, yield ultimately to repose. That being said, these are, in the final analysis, just piano sonatas, without lyrics or any other text to tell us in explicit terms what, if anything, they are about. So any interpretations we make of them are ultimately just that, interpretations. I should probably disclose at this juncture that Beethoven's last three piano sonatas are works which are particularly close to my heart. They are, of course, pinnacles of the piano literature. They're pieces that every pianist wants to play someday. And in my case, that desire was amplified by the fact that one of my piano teachers growing up, Gerard Willems, was the first Australian to record the complete Beethoven sonatas and concertos. I myself have been playing these sonatas for almost a decade now, because I started playing Opus 110 in my final year of high school. And I've also recorded all three of the sonatas on my debut album, which came out in 2021, and in a lovely kind of circularity was recorded in this very hall. These works haven't only engaged me as a performer, they've also captured my attention as an analytical and historical music scholar. My PhD thesis is on exactly the topic of this evening's lecture recital, these supposed narratives of life, death, and the afterlife in the late Beethoven piano sonatas. So let me now clarify what it is that I wish to do in our rather lengthy time together this evening. My goal tonight is actually quite simple: to get all of you thinking about what this music, and what music in general, means to you, however that meaning might be construed. I'm going to start with a bit of biographical background on what was happening to Beethoven around the time these pieces were written. And then I'm going to move into a brief survey of historical criticism of these sonatas, to give you a little taste of what these works have meant to particularly commentators closer to Beethoven's time. I'm going to take you through a couple of what I like to call analytical vignettes. So, shortish passages of music, which we're going to explore in some detail, particularly through the lens of these poetic ideas that we have been discussing. Then we're going to take a break, and then after the break I will come back and attempt to show you what these pieces mean to me in what Felix Mendelssohn would have called the most precise way, which is by playing them. So I'm going to play Opus 109, then Opus 110, then there will be a further break, because believe me, we're all going to need it, and then we'll come back for the big one, Opus 111. My ultimate thesis tonight, if there is such a thing, is that whether or not we buy into the life and death stuff, this is music that speaks to us on a very profound level, that stimulates the intellect and that touches the very deepest parts of our psyche. And that it's worth sharing our thoughts on this music if for no other reason than the interpersonal closeness such a process brings us. So, let us then talk a bit about biography. These last three piano sonatas, Beethoven's final testaments in the piano sonata genre, were written at a time in Beethoven's life that can only be described as turbulent. He experienced pretty awful health around the time these sonatas were written, approximately 1819 to 1822, not including earlier sketch work. In particular, in the first half of 1821, he nearly died from a combination of jaundice and rheumatic fever, which I believe were related conditions in his case, though not being a rheumatologist, I'm probably not the authority on this. And this was in addition to ongoing gastrointestinal issues, brewing hepatitis, which ultimately killed him, arising, in fairness, from his alcoholism, and also severe deafness. So it was all happening for Beethoven at this point. In addition, he had been embroiled in a bitter battle for custody of his nephew Karl, whom he managed to wrangle from his much-loathed sister-in-law Johanna, but not without significant personal and financial costs. There were also troubles in professional life. The genesis of Opus 111, for instance, was marred by an absolute hot mess of publishers and editions and early versions of the sonata's dedication. No one seemed to be able to get their story straight, as it were, on this piece. So lots of really serious stuff going on, and it's not difficult to imagine that this serious stuff might have influenced Beethoven's compositional process in whatever way. However, that does not necessarily mean that the music was always serious. And probably the funniest example of this is the second movement of the sonata, Opus 110, which, when you first listen to it, actually sounds rather stern, but in fact features two German folk tunes. Unser Katz hat Katzen gehabt, our cat has had kittens, and ich bin jüdlich, du bist jüdlich. I'm a slop or a hobo, you're a slop. And the story goes that Beethoven himself was taken for a hobo around the time this sonata was written, because one night he got himself very lost in Wiener Neustadt, and he wasn't dressed very well, and apparently he smelled pretty bad, and he was seen looking into the windows of nearby buildings, which actually led him to be arrested. And Beethoven protested, saying, "You can't do this to me, I'm Beethoven, I'm famous." And the copper didn't miss a beat. He said, yeah, sure, you're not Beethoven, you're a hobo. Beethoven doesn't look like that. So there you go. At any rate, let us then talk in a little bit more detail about historical trends, historical critical trends more specifically, relating to these last three Beethoven sonatas. One recurring critical trope, which is discussed at length in Mark Evan Bonds' book, The Beethoven Syndrome, is the practice of hearing Beethoven himself as an implied protagonist in his music. Not only these last three piano sonatas, but Beethoven's works generally. This idea of an autobiographical testament in whatever way in these works. And in particular, 19th century critics were wont to hear the epic musical odysseys of the last last three piano sonatas in terms not only of life and death, but Beethoven's life and death. And a terrific example of this is the writings of a bloke called Adolf Bernhard Marx, A.B. Marx. No relation to Karl Marx, to the best of my knowledge, but happy to be corrected if anyone has any advances on that. And it's quite an achievement. Marx manages to read a life and death narrative into literally every single one of these last three piano sonatas. On the coda of the first movement of the sonata opus 109, he writes this: "The piece, which began cheerfully, sinks reverently but hesitantly into a chorale-like chord progression. The dwindling hope is followed by surrender. Then it plays out further on the quiet and deeply restful fundamental note." Beethoven too once thought he was facing death and sighed from the bottom of his heart, "Come when you want, I'm going to meet you courageously." Then, about the third movement of Opus 110, Marx writes this: "It is an uplifting spectacle to see human energy fighting against and triumphing over a powerful adversity. Beethoven's genius survives such a battle. Deafness has robbed him of every livelier means of communication. Beethoven had the power to withstand this struggle and has emerged from the fight more invigorated and uplifted than before." And finally, about the second movement of Opus 111, the last movement in the trilogy, Marx really goes far out. Listen to this. "Beethoven, having died, had appeared to humanity in the form of a gigantic spirit, which announced, 'You never recognise me. Observe, this was my mighty life. These pains have purified me. These rays of hope from Elysium, these sounds from the blessed years of youth have strengthened me and nourished my timid heart, and now I die.'" And that little chestnut of an exegesis is made all the more striking by the fact that Marx was very well aware that Beethoven was actually still alive when he was writing this. This was 1824 in the Berliner Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. Beethoven died in 1827. So obviously, we probably shouldn't hold 19th century criticism up as the model of scholarly integrity by modern standards. I think it's fair to say that there was a healthy dollop of fancy, of poetry in a lot of this so-called 19th century musicology. But it is interesting to see the trends in what commentators were saying about these pieces. Another critical trend is the idea that these last three piano sonatas are akin to works of literature in their quasi-narrative power. A great example of this would be what Hans von Bülow, the 19th century pianist, composer and conductor, had to say about the fourth variation of the third movement of Opus 109 in his edition of the Beethoven sonatas, which by the way is really interesting. If you want some amazing time capsule stuff, I highly recommend that edition. He writes, "The editor recommends," the editor being himself, "as the best guide to the beautiful delivery of this masterpiece of polyphonic, that is, imitative song, the recalling of Goethe's words in the first monologue of Faust. How powers celestial, rising and descending, their golden buckets ceaseless interchange." And indeed, there is a kind of interchange in this variation, as you'll hear, this beautiful interplay between the voices. I've just been prompted to give a Wi-Fi password. Please go away. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, I think it's gone. Great. Unable to... Alright, I think the internet's dropped out, but I don't think it'll affect us. Let us carry on. And this continued right into the 20th century as well. One spectacular example being the works of a guy called Arnold Scherling, who basically compares the Sonata Opus 110 to Friedrich Schiller's play Mary Stuart, and Opus 111 to Shakespeare's King Henry V. And as you can see from the example on the right of the slide there, what he actually does is he will take lines from the play and assign those lines to particular sections of the music, complete with bar numbers and everything. And just in case you thought this phenomenon was consigned to the dusty annals of history, Robert Wallace in 2008 drew moment-by-moment comparisons between Opus 111 and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, and you can see an example there that I won't read out. So, to be clear, I am not necessarily sharing these takes to endorse them. To be completely honest, I find all of them, to varying degrees, a little bit far-fetched. But it is interesting to see how many commentators over the years have sought to pinpoint the meaning they perceive in this music through literary works. Okay, let us now jump into the music. A little disclaimer, over the next few slides I am going to be including score examples because I know there are people in this hall with us tonight who, if I don't have score examples on my PowerPoint, will be calling them up on IMSLP on their phones. So these are for those people. But if you are not somebody who reads music or doesn't read music fluently, please do not worry. If I am doing my job properly as a presenter tonight, you should still be able to find interest and engagement in what we are talking about. So, the first of our analytical vignettes is going to be the third movement of Opus 110. After a kind of exploratory, searching introduction, Beethoven moves into a section that he calls Klagende Gesang, or in Italian, Arioso dolente, both of which mean mourning song. Not mourning as in 10 a.m., mourning as in M-O-U-R, mourning as in lamenting. So this music is quite explicitly identified with grief of whatever form, and I'm going to suggest that various of its musical features serve to reinforce that feeling of grief. One of which is the key. This arioso is cast in A flat minor, which is not exactly the sight reader's favourite. It's got a lot of flats to deal with, even though Beethoven weirdly doesn't use all of them in the key signature here. It's difficult to read, it's thorny. And I would suggest, as many others have, that the sheer difficulty of processing music in this key might reinforce the kind of emotional or psychological difficulty that's being spoken of in this lament. The melody here has to be one of the most tear-jerking melodies ever conceived for the piano. Let nobody say, as amazingly to me they often do, that Beethoven didn't know how to embrace the lyrical qualities of the instrument. It's soaring, this melody, it's quite free in terms of how it evades the beat via what we call syncopation, but it has this central sadness to it. And that sadness is encapsulated by the fact that the start of the melody is a descent, is one long downward line. It's very, very heavy laden emotionally in that way. This melody, however, is pitted against something very different in the left hand, and that is this accompaniment in thudding repeated chords. Now, to be clear, repeated chords are a pretty common accompanimental trope. Beethoven's not going to win any awards for ingenuity using this. But these particular repeated chords have a kind of grim inexorability. They're inevitable, they're unstinting, and it seems that they, in a sense, seek to break the spirit of this soaring melody. The grimness comes in large measure from the fact that these chords are positioned down very low in the, relatively low in the piano's register. And that the notes, as you can see, even if you don't read music, you see how the black dots are very close together. The notes are very tightly spaced, so there's a kind of murkiness, there's a kind of obscurity to these chords. I'm now going to play you a little bit of this Arioso dolente, and this example, as with all the audio examples I'll play in the lecture component tonight, will be from my own recording. Here we go. This arioso dolente ends right down in the bowels of the instrument with these very dark, deep octaves. And it seems difficult to imagine how one would construct hope from that point. But Beethoven manages to do so. And that hope comes in the form of a fuga, a three-voice fugue. Now, fugue was historically regarded as the cerebral form, the intellectual form. And indeed, it is quite intellectually rigorous as a compositional feat. It's also intellectually rigorous to play. So we have the sense here that somehow we are processing the grief of the arioso dolente through this cerebral fugue. The fugue, appropriately enough, is in the brighter A-flat major, contrasting with the arioso's A-flat minor. And while the arioso began with this fundamentally descending line, the fugue subject, the main musical idea on which the fugue is based, is fundamentally ascending, consisting of a succession of ascending fourths, as you can see there. Let me play you now a bit of the fugue. And it seems to be all coming to a rather victorious climax, except when it doesn't. Beethoven manages to thwart things by means of a very nasty harmonic trick, a trick of the chords. For the technical music heads in the audience, what he does is he takes the dominant seventh of A-flat major and reinterprets that inharmonically as a German augmented sixth. Point being, the music doesn't go where we expect it to go. And where it ends up is back in the desolation of the arioso dolente. Although this time, the grief of the arioso is even more acute. Tellingly, Beethoven marks this second arioso not only dolente, not only lamenting, but perdendo le forze, losing strength, losing force. There's a sense that this now is not only grief-stricken, it's exhausted, it's spent, it's physically worn out. And we feel this, if it's played well, on a very visceral level. The thudding chords are back, I should say, they are here. But interestingly, this time the melody is, although broadly the same as before, different insofar as it's disjointed. It's chopped up, it's fragmented, as we say in technical terms. And this gives us the sense, as many commentators have observed, that the hypothetical singer of this song, arioso does mean a song-like passage, is perhaps just unable to continue as before, perhaps too choked with tears to continue as before. Pointedly too, the key this time is not A-flat minor, but G minor. Beethoven's moved the whole thing down a semitone, just a very small amount, which gives the sense that everything is quite literally flat. Gives a sense that the music just doesn't have the energy to reach the peaks of the first time around. It's very poignant. Let's have a listen to it now. 2 finishes really in the depths. And if it was difficult to imagine how hope could be constructed from this the first time around, this time it seems nigh on impossible. But that's when Beethoven gives us a miracle. And that miracle comes in place of the expected G minor resolution to this G minor arioso as a G major chord, a lighter, brighter, more hopeful chord. Not just one of them, 10 of them, 10 repeated G major chords, which get progressively louder, like a far-off sight that's coming closer, the details becoming clearer as it approaches. And then we hear this. Sounded familiar, well, you'd be right. It's the fugue from before. One twist. It's l'inversione della fuga. It's the inversion of the fugue. What Beethoven has done is he's taken that fugue subject from before, that idea on which the fugue is based, and he's flipped it on its head. He's inverted it. So the music quite literally enacts seeing or approaching the same situation, the same circumstances from a new perspective. Once again, Beethoven gives us a very poignant, expressive direction. He writes, poi a poi di nuovo vivente, little by little, coming back to life, which is really interesting. We've had our grief, we've had our mourning song, then some order restored via the first fugue, then grief coupled with physical exhaustion, this kind of brokenness, losing strength, and now coming back to life. And the music does indeed come back to life. Obviously it's a bit more upbeat than the arioso was, but even within this fugue realm, the rhythms get quicker, what we call diminution, progressively quicker note values, and we end up back in the tonic key for a triumphant virtuosic coda, which I will save for the concert. So, how then are we to make sense of this movement, the sequence of events in this movement, in terms of life, death, and transcendence construed broadly? One exegetic option, of course, would be reincarnation, the idea that somebody loses strength and they're broken and then they literally come back to life. But even within the realm of this pretty poetically ambitious kind of work, that seems to be, at least to me, pushing the envelope a little. Perhaps a better analogue for what we have in this movement, and I want to be very clear that I mean an analogue, not something that's being directly represented, is something a bit like a near-death experience. Something by which someone comes close to death, or perhaps someone very close to them passes away. And then from their lowest point, they manage to pull themselves back from the brink. They manage to heal. They manage to restore a fullness of life. I must say, I find that more persuasive myself. And the main reason for that is that it aligns very neatly with what happened to Beethoven in the year this sonata was composed. Remember how at the start I was saying that at the start of 1821, Beethoven nearly died with various ailments he had, and he counted himself damn lucky to be alive? Yeah, that was the year he was writing the sonata. And commentators since that time have been quick to point out the connections. Of course, correlation is not causation. I don't want to be misunderstood as saying it is. But certainly there was a correlation. And perhaps further evidence for this idea is the fact that this isn't Beethoven's only treatment of the idea of recovery or convalescence within the domain of his late instrumental works. The slow movement of his string quartet, opus 132, is subtitled Holy Song of Thanksgiving by a Convalescent to the Deity. So there's that convalescence, there's that poi a poi di nuovo vivente coming back again. I want to pass on just two more fun facts about Opus 110, which I think might be relevant before we move on. Firstly, this sonata is unusual among Beethoven's piano sonatas insofar as it doesn't have a dedication. It wasn't dedicated to anybody, which has led commentators such as the great pianist and scholar, he really is a scholar, Alfred Brendel, referring to this sonata as a very personal confession. This is not a note to or a homage to a patron or a friend or another musician. This is just Beethoven's own testament, as it were. The second fact is that the manuscript is dated a very special day in 1821, and that is the 25th of December. The manuscript is dated Christmas Day in 1821, despite the fact that source studies by Kinderman and others point to the fact that Beethoven had actually pretty much finished it a fair bit earlier than that. So, some may be tempted to invoke Christian iconography on that, but I think my solution would just be to say this sonata is a Christmas present to the world and a celebration of the gift that is life. Pretty heavy stuff, but let's do one more analytical vignette before we go to our interval. And that is the end of the first movement going into the start of the second and last movement in the last sonata in the trilogy, Opus 111. Opus 111's first movement, the first movement of Opus 111, is about the stormiest, most dramatic conception you could possibly imagine. It starts with a very arresting rhetorical introduction, which seems to owe something to the antique French overture. And then it moves into a main fast movement, which is all driving and frenzy and frenetic and desperate. It's cast in C minor, which is not only a dark minor key, but often the tonal locus, if you like, of Beethoven's most tragic, most dramatic proclamations. And it's suffused to an extraordinary extent with a particularly tense kind of chord, and that is a diminished seventh chord, which sounds like this. If you've ever watched B-grade movies, old B-grade movies, that's the chord that will normally be played when something spooky happens, you know, when the detective finds a dead body or whatever it might be. And not only is this movement based on one diminished seventh chord, it's based on a sequence of three diminished seventh chords, which collectively cover all 12 notes of the chromatic scale, all the white and black keys on the piano. So if the diminished seventh chord is so tense, then this tension takes on a kind of all-consuming sense. It engulfs the whole thing. And I should say, every section, it has been shown, every section of this movement is based on this, what Lawrence Kramer calls the diminished seventh aggregate, this sequence of diminished seventh chords. So, very, very turbulent movement. I want to focus on the end of this movement, the coda. The coda of this movement starts with these violent, hammered, offbeat chords. Bum, 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 which, if played well, shouldn't be nice, right? This should not be cantabile, get an A+ for your grade 4 piano playing. This should be nasty. This should be, you know, making the piano lid fall off stuff, right? It's very nasty, and some people have even suggested that these chords might have something to do with guillotine. I'm not going to go that far, but they're certainly violent, although the violence does ease a little bit by means of the diminuendo getting softer and also the fact that the chords get longer in the way Beethoven notates them. Then we come to the last three lines. In the last three lines, the left hand is concerned with these running lines that kind of swirl up and down, perhaps the last remaining billows of the storm, to go back to that little meteorological analogy. The right hand, however, is altogether different. It's concerned with these sustained hymn-like chords, which seem almost single-handedly to chill out the musical landscape, to sort of be, you know, calming the waters, as it were. Instructively as well, each of these three phrases moves from the darkness of the minor to the light of the major, and it is with C major that we finish this movement. So, as with Opus 110, we have this phenomenon of minor giving way to major. But the effect of that here is altogether different. Whereas in Opus 110, we had a sense that the major mode triumphed over the minor. It conquered the grief, it conquered the darkness. There was a sort of valiant rubbishing of that grief, for want of a better description. In Opus 111, we have more a sense of acquiescence, of yielding, to use a word that's been applied to this sonata a great deal over the centuries, of submission. Indeed, one might suggest that after this absolutely headlong, crazy movement that we've had, this comes almost like giving up the fight. I'll play you now the end of the first movement of Opus 111, and you can decide for yourselves. Literally from within this chord, same notes, just hands moving closer together, emerges the theme of the very long second movement of this final Beethoven piano sonata, a theme which Beethoven calls the arietta, a little song. I would suggest that the term antithesis is nowhere near strong enough for the contrast that this arietta brings with the first movement. As opposed to the first movement's dramatic, stormy C minor, this movement is once and for all in the bright light of C major. As opposed to the first movement's headlong drive, this movement is glacially, timelessly slow. I actually did a study of some representative recordings of this movement as part of my PhD and found that the average tempo that well-established pianists, at least in the recordings I studied, take for this movement is dotted quaver 42, which, if you know anything about the metronome, or even if you don't know anything about the metronome, you can probably agree is pretty damn slow. As opposed to the first movement's quite militaristic four-square rhythm with all its hard edges, this movement is in 9 time, so 3 groups of 3. It's all circles, it's all flowing. And perhaps most of all, the diminished 7th aggregate, this sequence of diminished 7th chords, really, really tense chromatic chords, here gives way to the purest, most elemental, simplest use of harmony you could possibly imagine, at least in this theme, with barely any notes outside of the tonic key at whatever point. It's what we call very diatonic. This arietta theme, then, is one of, at least in my humble opinion, the most beautiful bits of music in the entire piano literature. I also find it very, very sad, and I am not afraid to admit that I have more than once shed a tear listening to this movement, and even on occasion playing it. We'll see if that happens later tonight, but here on my recording is the first movement, the second movement theme of Opus 111. So, whatever our views on this kind of analysis, it's not altogether difficult to see how commentators from Marx onwards have been moved to think of mortal struggle giving way to ultimate repose in this sequence of musical events. And I would, in fact, go so far as to suggest that this reading forms kind of a critical trope in its own right. So often has it been put forward. I'll give you just one last example of this, and that's this quote by the Baltic writer Wilhelm von Lentz, whom we have to thank for the division of Beethoven's works into 3 periods that we normally use today. He writes that this arietta is the rustling of an Aeolian harp, the voice coming from on high, which calls Faust, of course referring to Goethe's Faust, as 19th century critics really like to do. The pardon uttered by the victim, the holy mountain which elevates the just to the acclamations of the celestial host, from where one last time he will embrace the world which he leaves forever. There is so much more I would love to tell you about these last 3 piano sonatas of Beethoven. I'd love to talk, for instance, about the role of performance practice in positioning the listener to understand the meaning, or at least the broader affect or feeling of the music. But if I were to do that, we'd probably be here until about 1 AM, which I wouldn't mind, but perhaps some of you mightn't like so much. So I think we'd probably better wrap things up. So, to sum up, whether we buy into the life, death and the afterlife stuff is entirely up to us. And I don't mind admitting that despite writing my PhD thesis in this, I don't always hit the music in these ways. Heavens no. But nevertheless, at a time when music can be streamed at the touch of a button, when listening to Opus 111 is arguably no more or no less of an event than streaming the latest TikTok video, when recordings and competition culture have, in large measure, sucked a bit of the life, a bit of the humanity out of music in their pursuit of quasi-scientific perfection. I think that having conversations like we're having tonight, where we share our emotion, our unabashedly subjective responses to the music, plays a really important role in keeping the magic of our art form going and keeping our love for it going as well. And as the great Beethoven pianist Arthur Schnabel wrote, love has to be the starting point. Love of music. Love always produces some knowledge, while knowledge only rarely produces something similar to love. It's my fond hope that this evening's lecture recital will stimulate your love for these pieces for years to come. We'll take a 50-minute break and then I will see you from behind the keyboard. Thanks very much.